Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm here again with John Stewart. This is his second time here. Last time we had a very deep conversation, lots of points of convergence and of insight. John has made an argument in publication, and we reviewed it obviously at a much higher level because we were talking. You can't convey as much. But this very powerful argument that there is a non-teleological, and that was important, and we talked about that, a non-teleological trajectory to the course of evolution of not mere increased complexity, a thesis that I think is vague, and when you make it specific, is often falsified. John has a much more specific and I think important point, which is what tends to survive, what evolution seems to be broadly meta-selecting for, in addition to selecting for specific features or species, it seems to be meta-selecting for increased cooperation and increased entification, the creation of more sophisticated organisms, entities that are built out of intricate cooperation of lower order entities. So we explore that in great depth. John has proposed that we can appropriate that, unlike previous parts of that history where it has occurred automatically in a merely sort of brute causal fashion. We are now at the stage where we can consciously appropriate and apprehend this, or perhaps direct it or misdirect it, and that part of human spirituality should function to make us more properly attuned to affording this new emergent cooperative entification, the creation of a superorganism in some fashion. And we talked quite a bit about the left and the right hand kinds of, or left and right spiritualities of freedom, sort of absorption spiritualities versus, which I think, John, you called thy will be done, and then more agentic spiritualities, my will. And we're at a place where we can properly consider integrating them. And this was all very profound, and I thought very enriching. The fact that it is simultaneously non-teleological but has a normative demand on it, more normative demand on us, I think I find very, very promising. I find that to be something very, very interesting about what John is doing. One of the things I'd like to do today, after I give John a chance to just identify himself again, is I'd like to examine two possible connecting points between that overarching model that John built for us last time around enhanced cooperation and the spiritual apprehension and appropriation of that, and what that has to say about a lot of the discussion that is emerging in this corner of the internet around hyper objects and hyper agents and egregores and collective intelligence, etc., and how that seems simultaneously cutting edge and very ancient. It seems to bring together the mythological and the scientific in a weird way. But some of you have seen conversations, for example, the most recent one between Jonathan Pajot, Jordan Hall, and myself. So that's one thing I'd like to explore with John. And then the other one was something we touched upon, but I'd like to come back to it, which is like, how is this superorganism going to be different, or how should we try to shape it so that it does not become totalitarian, Kafkaesque kinds of entities that degrade human life? And we and Jonathan and Jordan Hall and I talked about this in terms of, avoiding the parasitic processing version of this. So that's the framing that we're in. And now I hope I did justice to it. I'm sure I missed out things that you would consider important, and I might have misrepresented things to some degree, but hopefully I did enough, John, to set our context and to appropriately welcome you into discussion again. So thank you for coming again.
Thanks very much, John. That was a great overview. I think I can go home now, so nothing more to say.
Well, let's pick it up on that point, which is the first point. There's a lot of emerging discussion about, the next Buddha is the Sangha. We've got egregores. We've got the idea of hyper agents. We've got the idea of collectivities, things that take on a life of their own, collective intelligence running on distributed cognition. This is, swarms, and there's all kinds of terms floating around in different conceptions. And I'm trying to participate in the conversations, bringing some clarity. But what do you think about all of these? Do you think that these are intimations of something happening? Do you think they are an attempt to bring the spirituality to bear on appropriating the trajectory of evolution? What's your reflections on this sort of, there's this effervescence and fervor around this right now? Do you think it points to something or converges with your work in some way?
Yes, I think it does, in a number of ways. I mean, first and foremost, analytical rational cognition, the first Enlightenment thinking, has great difficulty in understanding collectives, because they're complex, they can't be thought through, they're unanalysable. So when you start to get the emergence of the, what I can call second Enlightenment thinking or metasystemic thinking, the ability to mentally model complex systems in motion as they evolve, as they interact, and so on. When you get the beginning of the emergence of that capacity, then you get the beginning of the emergence of the understanding of collectives. So to give a sort of concrete example of where the absence of that metasystemic thinking, leads to a very impoverished view of the world and reality. If we look at the transhumanist movement, which is clearly at the analytical rational level, it's highly analytical and so on, then its vision of the future and of future evolution is basically highly individualistic. So the notion is that individuals will have their capacities greatly extended and so on, and that's the next great step in the evolution of life on Earth. What it ignores, and almost extraordinarily ignores once you see it, is that that we already have the emergence of post-human intelligence, post-human entities and so on in this planet that are far, far superior in terms of cognitive capacity and so on than individuals, enhanced or otherwise. And that's the emergence of collectives. So I wrote an article once about Nietzsche's Ubermensch, and the basic theme of the argument is that the Ubermensch is already here, emerging, and the Ubermensch is the collective. The Ubermensch is the society. The Ubermensch is, for example, the collective organised through the internet and so on. So the collective of humanity now has capacities far, far greater than any individual can ever have. I mean, it's trivially obvious, but in the context of the limitations of analytical rational cognition that doesn't see it, it needs to be said. So, and that's where the evolutionary perspective comes in loud and clear, that the whole history of life on Earth, the trajectory of life on Earth is towards the successive integration of living processes into cooperatives of increasing scale. And it's a stepwise process in which the cooperatives at one level that form at one level form cooperatives that become the entities at the next level, and so on and so on. And the critically important thing that the evolutionary perspective gives it is that it points to how that's achieved. It points towards the specific mechanisms that organise those collectives, that are necessary to organise those collectives. So it enables us then to develop this meta-narrative that points to what we have to do to advance the evolutionary trajectory further on Earth. and how we achieve that specifically. So it's not just about that yes, we need to have form a global entity. It's the specific ways in which that needs to be arranged that are pointed to by how higher level collectives were arranged at lower levels of evolution and organisation. And their governance becomes critically important. And that's the second issue you raise. How can we ensure that governance becomes operates as enabling constraints? That is, governance that increases diversity, increases evolvability, increases creativity, increases, from the perspective of the individuals within the collective, increases the freedom, increases creativity, increases opportunities for individuals, and so on. So we'll get into that, but that's broad. That's the broad perspective of collectives. That the next great stages in the evolution of life on Earth are about the collective, are about societies, are about larger scale cooperation, and so on. So I would suggest that yes, the intimations that are emerging about the importance of collectives basically are fueled by the beginning of the emergence of post-First Enlightenment thinking and so on, that can begin to see and appreciate the collectives. However, this movement, as I understand it, hasn't yet moved into the societal level of organisation. It's more focused on lower level collectives, lower level agents, and so on. And because it's founded on and driven by intimations rather than by systematic mental modelling of collectives, then it tends to be more spiritually orientated, less cognitively inclined, and so on. So where does that leave these smaller scale collectives and their collective intelligence and so on? And broadly, I'd suggest that they are an important part of the picture, but they're not the main part of the picture, and that to get a meta narrative that can guide metamodernism and guide integralism, you need to go to the big picture in evolution. You need to look at the emergence of a global entity and how that can be achieved, and so on. Basically, humanities, you can look at the trajectory of evolution in this regard in humanity in 3 steps. In the beginning, pre-modern times, our meaning and purpose in existence came from grand narratives, from meta-narratives that involve the postulation of supernatural entities. So the only stories that human beings could generate that made some sense of their existence were ones that involved gods, spirits, supernatural entities, and so on. Then the second stage in this 3-step transition was the emergence of analytical, rational, first Enlightenment thinking, which basically was like an acid that dissolved these grand narratives, the meta-narratives that previously gave meaning and purpose to human existence, because it basically, pointed out the lack of foundation for belief in supernatural entities. It undid the stories. It dissolved them. And basically we're, in the midst of that, hopefully moving towards the end of that phase. But the next phase is the reinstatement of grand narratives, the reinstatement of a meta-narrative that is not able to be undermined by first Enlightenment thinking, analytical, rational thinking. It doesn't entail supernatural entities. It's a science-based grand narrative, a science-based meta-narrative, and it can fill the gap that I would argue is clearly, evidently missing in movements like metamodernism and integralism, which basically, start off with great fervour and energy and so on, but integralism's past its peak. It's on the way down. And I would suggest that the reason why it is because of the absence of any meta-narrative that gives meaning and purpose and direction and a measuring stick that can be used to assess the values and so on that drive a project like integralism. So they're broadly, so to me, it's, the meta-narrative is most important. So where do these more spiritually orientated practices, where are they relevant in this? I would suggest that their cognitive capacity, their ability to develop mental models that can underpin and generate, the grand narrative is fairly limited. The practices and approaches that I've been, I've had knowledge of, they're largely about collective presence, the attainment of collective presence. And the attainment of collective presence, is an extremely powerful tool, but it's only a tool within the general toolbox. And its fundamental limitation is that if it does, as it can, produce collective insights that are significant and insightful and so on, it has difficulty in holding on to those outside or, once the group's dissolved. And that's because if it produces insights into, that entail complex thinking about complex phenomenon, then if the individuals in the group don't have the mental modeling capacity, if they don't have sufficient cognitive capacity at the second enlightenment level, then the scaffolding provided by the group, once it's removed, you get a collapsing of the of the insights and so on.
Yeah, I agree with that very fundamentally. One of the things, well, first of all, both directions. One of the things I've been trying to do with work with Guy Sendstock and Christopher Mastietro and Johannes Niederhauser and Daniel Zaruba is build this notion of dialectic into dialogos, in which exactly the capacity, the we presencing gets internalized back into also an individual capacity for self-transcendence in some important way, which is much more the ancient Platonic model. You don't have just the dialogos. The dialectic isn't just, the collective, it's also the self-transcending, right? And the horizontal and the vertical dimensions, I think, for the reasons you just gave, have to be integrated together. If we just get caught up in the we space, exactly like you said, there won't be a way to preserve and transfer the insights coming out of that we space into the everyday lives of everyday people, and that will just mean it will not go anywhere as a project of cultural transformation. Towards your first criticism, which I also agree with, I'm responding to them in reverse order. Sorry. I'm involved in the project of trying to come up with the design features for stitching these various emerging communities together into a more comprehensive culture, and therefore, which would be meso. It wouldn't be at the level you're talking about, but I think it's the needed thing to get them towards that greater collective you're pointing to. And so I totally agree with both your points, and I see my agreement is such that it translates in me trying to actively address those criticisms in the culture building that I'm engaged with, and in the understanding of dialectic, which is an attempt to integrate meta-systemic cognition with this collective we presencing, and enable it to be transferable, and to get both of those things actually, those two dimensions integrated together. It's at the core of what I'm trying to do right now. So I think I your criticisms, I take, well, I'm in agreement with them, indeed, the original meaning of the word indeed. So I take it that's very well said. I'm wondering what you think then of what, like you made some very good criticisms of integral. Do you therefore, I think I foresee your answer, but I want to hear it from you. Do you think that metamodernism is probably going to recapitulate that trajectory? There will be sort of an expanse and then a collapse? Or do you think metamodernism is trying to build the metasystemic cognition and the cultural collective in a way that integral didn't? Do you see a difference historically between integral and metamodernism, or is it too soon to tell? Or what do you, what do you see?
Right, well, yes, I think it's already demonstrating that it is recapitulating, it's in the process of recapitulating the trajectory of integralism, but it is different. The key difference is that it's highly political. So it is about developing political movements, having political parties. In fact, it probably arose, to a significant extent, apart from the artistic side, but it arose from political movements, and that was missing in integralism. In integralism, was sort of like it was irrelevant to, or it saw the all the political goings on as irrelevant. Largely, it went on as if they weren't important. But it's recapitulating the trajectory in the sense that it already, it seems to me, is losing energy, and is starting to dissipate. There were great hopes around it. Now, on the issue of, is it going further in an important way by, for example, promoting higher cognitive capacities and developing technologies for achieving that? Absolutely not. I mean, I'm actually on the Metamodern forum, and that's one issue I raised there as about this. It seems to me there are two great deficiencies in the Metamodern project. One is the absence of an overarching grand narrative. It takes political issues as important in themselves and doesn't embed them in this bigger structure that can discipline them and guide them and so on. So that's one great deficiency, the absence of the grand narrative. And the second is the absence of any technology designed to develop what it sees as critically important, which is the development of a metasystemic cognitive capacity, the ability to see complexity and understand it and manipulate it and so on. So on that point, Hansi Freinach's metamodernism books basically suggests that there are possibly genetic limitations to the development of metasystemic cognition, cast doubt on whether it can be technologized, and cast doubt on a project that is central to my current interest, and that is the development of an escalator, a developmental escalator which will take people from analytical rational cognition to metasystemic cognition, and the social emotional development that enables us to transcend our the influences of our biological and cultural past and move at right angles to them. So in fact, there's a statement in the second Hansi Freinach book that basically says that the hope for developing these higher capacities might depend upon the development of transhumanism. So it's very pessimistic about that. So and I don't see any shift in that. I don't see them, that there's any movement in the direction of technologizing these things. So one thing I want to mention, that because that's something that I've been getting re-involved in, is this project of developing an escalator. I'm not sure whether I mentioned my during our last discussion about the first planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment.
Yes, you did mention.
I think I did. Yeah, it's coming back to me now. So that was part of that project. You know, there were integral people involved and so on, but basically there was very little happening in the world as far as that meeting could ascertain about the development of such an escalator. I've got re-involved in it. Unfortunately, now there still seems to be very little happening, you know, in the world about it. But one area that I might cross-fertilise with your you know, similarly directed project is on the issue of Otto Lasky's work, and before him a guy called Michael Vervaeke's on dialectical thinking.
Yes.
So you're aware of their work.
I ordered the one book on your recommendation. I haven't read it yet, but I do have it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So basically what Vervaeke did, you know, early in his academic career, was that he wanted to find out what constituted what he called dialectical thinking, but can be called metasystemic thinking.
Yeah.
So he interviewed a range of thinkers and looked for their movements in thought. So he didn't look at the content of what they were doing with it. He looked at the movements in thought that they went through when they you know, were dealing with some complex issue, and he tried to identify them, group them into categories, and so on. And Otto Lasky continued that work and came up with 4 quadrants of dialectic and 28 thought forms, which constitute those quadrants. They're the movements in thought and so on. And broadly, just very broadly speaking, analytical rational cognition focuses down on isolated parts of reality that it can think through and that it can develop mechanistic models of, and it's been very successful at the small proportion of phenomenon that can be adequately described and modelled by those kinds of limited mechanistic models. What it misses out on, and this is what Vervaeke and Lasky identified, what it misses out on is the context, and particularly the multi-layered context in which everything is embedded, including us and so on. Secondly, so apart from context, it missed out on process. So it reifies processes as objects, when in fact there is no such thing as an object. An object, all objects are theory laden, and any object in the sense that it isn't represented as a process is clearly theory laden, because everything's in flux, everything's in change, and so on. So it missed out on context, process, co-evolving relationships. That's components that co-evolve together, don't just interact according to laws like Newton's laws, but actually co-evolve and mutually influence one another. And then the 4th quadrant is putting these together and seeing them as the world is constituted by evolving, interacting, complex systems. So this has been, regularized. This has been the thinking that you need to have to move to escape the strictures of analytical rational thinking have been identified. You need to move your attention to these 4 quadrants, and in particular the 28 thought forms. Now, the significance of this for these group processes and moving out of the limited presencing, the group presencing, the really fun no effort part, the absorption part, to go back to that right and left hand. To move out of that, this scaffolding, this analysis of the movements in thought necessary to move you from analytical rational thinking to metasystemic thinking, that can be used within these groups to scaffold the dialectics process. And it's very basic. It's like a checklist, So, but Otto Lasky, he used his analysis to train interview practices where the function of the interviewer was to identify the current movements in thought used by the interviewee, identify any deficiencies, draw the attention of the interviewee to these deficiencies, and thereby scaffold their thinking more towards, metasystemic thinking. So that can be, so it seems to me that, in the Socratian dialogues, which have been, and because I've never dived into that as deeply as you, so to me, my perception of them has been filtered by the understandings of the Socratic processes and so on, arrived at by analytical rational thinkers.
Right.
Which pale, which miss the point almost entirely.
Yes.
The Socratic dialogues are not about critical thinking, or not in the analytical rational sense at all, to me.
No.
They're about scaffolding in a group process, scaffolding the thinking of others and oneself to fill in these gaps, to correct the absences, to remediate the absences in the thinking of the others. And it seems to me that process can be turbocharged by the use of the 4 quadrants and the 28 thought forms.
Yes. Yeah.
Within this group process.
Yeah, I hope to work on that integration. I'm going back to the stuff I've written on dialectic and dialogus, and I hope to work that integration that you're proposing to specifically undertake it this summer. So it's always about the time, but I should be able to do it. And so I definitely followed up. I haven't read the book. I have it, but the proposal you just made, I think, is beautiful and exciting. And it's very much something, again, I agree with, and I'm trying to undertake in response to our previous discussion. So I think that's exactly right. I think understood that way, the way you've extended it, I think that what's missing from a lot of these groups is that Socratic dialectic metasystemic capacity. And I agree that is very much something that needs to be given more priority. I'm very happy that third wave started by Gonzalez and others about reading, how much the non-propositional, that's their term for it, is actually the crucial thing happening in the Platonic dialogues. That's now coming to the forefront. I think affords, a kind of philosophical provenance for what we're talking about that lends plausibility and legitimacy to the overall proposal. It's like, no, there was a reason why this was a deep, like Vers Lewis, this was the backbone of, Western spirituality for a good reason. There was something going on here that needs to be recovered in a powerful way. So again, I'm sorry, I know you were hoping that there'd be points of significant divergence, but once again, I mean, I've already, not as much as the first 2 points, but I've at least begun the process of the proposal that you've just made, the point of convergence. And I think that's exactly right. I've been trying to get people to recover that ancient notion of rationality as the capacity for genuine self-transcendence, as opposed to the inferential repair of technical argumentation. We have limited the notion of rationality down to that, and we've lost that Platonic breadth. Although D.C. Schindler's book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, goes to great length at restoring that more comprehensive notion of rationality that I think you're putting your finger on. And it goes back to ratio, the proper proportioning, rather than, like I say, technologies of validity, which we've tended to reduce rationality to. So I think this is part, again, I think there's, again, given that understanding of rationality, not logicality, but rationality, as we're talking about, there's an insufficient account of the deep role of rationality in what we're talking about here, in this proposal for the spiritual appropriation of the trajectory evolution, to use some of your language, if I didn't trespass on it too much. And so that is a significant concern for me. One area where that shows up very practically for me is while there is a lot of sense of irony and fallibility in metamodernism, which is good. It counterbalances Cartesian hubris. I don't see enough actual self-correction going on, right? About, oh no, right? Which is, the hallmark, one of the hallmarks of taking the critical and making it the truly rational is that people have a capacity to undergo a process that's not just correcting, but also transcending how they have framed the original, their original way of thinking about something. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit vague here, but what I mean is that, to make it more simple, I don't see enough of the self-correcting and the self-transcending aspects of rationality being properly integrated together within metamodernism. I see discussion of self-transcendence, and I see some stuff about self-correction, but I don't see them properly integrated together in a way in which I think you and I are talking about right now. That's what I was trying to get to.
Right, yeah. So, you mentioned that the Western tradition, has certain characteristics for good reason.
Yeah.
Which is very, very appropriate, because you need it for good reason.
Yep. Yes.
For good reason.
Good. Well said. Nice play on words. That's very good, John. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that's influenced me, and this is, the integration of self-transcendence with the cognitive scaffolding, which to me is critically important. So I see that as epitomized by a central theme of the Western tradition, which is the marriage of the bride and the groom.
Yeah.
So the concept that that the next great stage is the marriage of the bride and the groom, broadly speaking, in a non-gendered sense, the female principle with the male principle.
Yes.
So that's the cognitive with the social, emotional, with the transcendence, with the presence in, and so on. So, and the question is how do you achieve that? So another way of attacking that is I've worked on the development of this escalator to take to achieve the marriage of the bride and the groom, to move from first enlightenment thinking to second enlightenment thinking, and the importance of the capacity to achieve presencing in that is significant in two respects. First of all, there's the need to disembed from your current thinking. So if you're at the analytical rational level of thinking, then if you encounter a problem in the world, you narrow down your attention, you look for ways in which you can reduce that problem to parts and understand it through the interaction of those parts and so on. So that's your go-to method. And it's easy to underestimate the stickiness of that capacity, but these levels are levels and stages to reasons. They're equilibrium points. They're defended from change. They're defended from transcendence. That's the reason why they persist through time and are recognizable, so widely. So the importance of presencing is that, in the Robert Keegan sense, it enables the formation of a higher level subject that is disembedded from what it was previously embedded in.
Right.
And what it was previously embedded in becomes an object to this new higher level subject. So these presencing technologies, including meditation at the individual level and these group processes of presencing, they can be brought to bear to achieve this disembedding, either the group disembedding or the individual disembedding from analytical rational cognition, creating the new form of organisation with a higher level disembedded self, but then can have the higher level cognition installed in it. But that second step's equally important, to then install the cognition,
Right.
and how do you scaffold it and so on. And it seems to me the Otto Laskian work moves in that direction. The second significance of the presence in capacity is that it brings in new factors in that are needed for metasystemic thinking that aren't purely cognitive, that can't be, identified cognitively with a Laskian approach, that need to draw on our capacities that are more generally associated with our emotional capacities, their pattern recognition abilities, and so on. So then this is the marriage of the bride and the groom.
Right.
So
right.
the female principle in a non-gendered sense, I have to keep saying that. I have a daughter who's, wonderful in studies and so on, who keeps me on track there. But the female principle involves the accessing these pattern recognition, intuitive capacities that can only be accessed through they're in the unconscious mind, and therefore generally excluded. So at the analytical rational level, embeddedness in analytical rational thinking excludes our ability to access these capacities.
Yes. Yeah.
So they were easily accessible at the pre-modern level, at the mythic level, at the level of story, but we contracted down to analytical rational thinking, which excluded and closed the door to these more general intuitive capacities, and we need to open the door to those for metasystemic thinking. So metasystemic thinking is more than just what you would see by straight cognition if you take an analytical rational perspective. It has to be powered by, supplemented by these social emotional capacities that can be accessed only by switching off the analytical rational thinking, by disembedding from the analytical rational thinking, enable impressions and so on to go through to the unconscious and to evoke these things. So that's to me, that's my understanding of what needs to be achieved by the in order to produce the marriage of the bride and the groom.
Yeah, I see that very much happening in the Socratic dialogue. Obviously, you have argumentation, but you also have Socrates' daemon, and you have following the logos of the argument, and you have all the drama, and that is as equally as important as the argument for understanding what's going on in the dialogues. So the dialogues are very much dynamically multidimensional, and we have people like Drew Highland and Gonzalez and others to thank for saying, all that stuff wasn't ornamentation around the argument. I remember being taught that as here's the arguments in Plato, and it's like, no, all that stuff isn't ornamentation around the argument. It is as equal a value, if not more value, than the propositional argumentation that's running at the center of the, like you say, the analytic approach. I think that marriage of the yin and the yang, or the left and the right, if we use Ian McGilchrist. I try to use the non-gendered language just to avoid all the culture war stuff surrounding it. I think I'm in deep agreement with that. And again, that was brought out and made central in the Neoplatonic tradition, Nicholas of Cusa proposing the coincidence of the opposites and all of that sort of thing as a you can understand learned ignorance of Nicholas of Cusa as, the summation of that Socratic process and exactly the integration of the bride and the groom, like you said, and that's the proper understanding of it. But of course, if you take just an analytic approach to it, well, why would I want, learned ignorance doesn't mean anything. It's just an oxymoron. It's just, right. But it's failing to grasp. Anyways, that's a core theme that I'm working on in the next big lecture series I'm developing. You'll be pleased to know, though, that lecture series will not just be a lecture series. There'll be each episode will have, the theoretical argumentation, but each episode will also have a set of practices I will be teaching to go along. So there will be, practices running in tandem with the theoretical argument, so that people are right from the beginning set to see this in a more meta-systemic, transformative context, rather than just an argumentative context. So you can tell I'm getting very excited talking to you, John. There's a lot that you're sparking in me, but we're running out of time, and we're sort of already touching on the thing. You did a bit of a foreshadow, but I want to return to the other concern that came up in the comments. And I did raise it last time, and you said a bit, and you've also foreshadowed it a bit, which is what should we do, and what should be the design features of our spirituality, if I can use that extended term, or use that term in extension, to prevent this movement towards the superorganism, or what I would call the hyper agent, right, from becoming a totalitarian tyrant, from becoming the next Star Trek, the Next Generation, the Borg, right? The Borg represent the liberal individualist terror of the collective. It's the nightmare of the collective, and it's supposed to make, oh no, liberal individualism is the only secure path. That's what the nightmare of the Borg was supposed to do. All right, and so I'm using that just as a popular myth, right, or mythogram, as a way of referring to it. How do we challenge the individualism that you are properly challenging here? And you're not challenging individual responsibility. I wish people would cleanly and completely separate those two from each other, right? How are you challenging this individualism without throwing us into the nightmare of the Borg, right? I hope you're aware of the Star Trek reference. It's been in enough movies and TV shows. I'm trying to get, but so that's the question. And you've all, like I said, you've foreshadowed a bit, but now's a chance. Let's go into it in depth. Because like I say, the classical liberal individualist sees that the only alternative to individualism is the Borg, is the Kafkaesque bureaucracy, is the Stalinist gulag, right? And you're saying, no, that is not the only alternative. So can you unpack that in depth, please?
Yes, well, if we go back to the evolutionary history of life on Earth, we can see how evolution solved that problem, or we can see what succeeded in evolutionary terms with the formation of collectives at lower levels. And, for example, each of us is, a galaxy of trillions of cells. Yeah. We are an organisation of cells, and we're a highly creative and adaptive organisation, and so on. How has that been achieved by evolution? Why has evolution produced the kind of collective that we are?
Right.
And so on. So first and foremost, evolution favours collectives that are highly evolvable,
right,
highly adaptable, and so on.
Right.
So a Borg is machine-like. The Borg is born of the analytical rational mind.
Right.
Yeah, because nearly all complexity science at present is an analytical rational reduction of true complexity. That's why they produce diagrams with circles and arrows between them and so on. That's supposedly how you represent complex systems, but no, that's static, that's mechanistic. So the analytical rational mind looks at complexity and sees a Borg. That's its natural thing to do. But metasystemic cognition looks at living collectives and sees a highly adaptable, highly evolvable, highly creative system, and it begins to see how to achieve that. And you can't achieve a highly adaptable, evolvable system with a mechanistic organisation. You certainly can't achieve it with a totalitarian organisation.
Right.
You need variety within the organisation itself. You need, to use an old cybernetic term of Ross Ashby, you need requisite variety. So to be able to deal with the variety, to be able to deal with the world in a high variety world, then an entity, a collective, needs to have high variety within itself.
Right.
So the question becomes, how do you achieve that?
Right.
And this is the problem of the governance. So when I was writing my book Evolution's Arrow, and I was going through the evolutionary trajectory, and it's all about governance. It's all about the way in which evolution achieved highly evolvable collectives was through the institution of governance. The way it solved the cooperation problem, where you begin with competing entities where self-interest prevails, the selfish gene prevails, speaking metaphorically, and you don't get cooperatives, even though cooperatives are in principle far more adaptable and evolvable and successful than individuals, isolated individuals acting alone. So the way that evolution solves the cooperation problem is through governance that punishes free riders and rewards cooperators, basically. So I was writing the book and I was thinking, this is going to be abhorrent. Everything I say is going to be abhorrent, particularly to people at the postmodern level, who are anti-hierarchy, anti-authority, allergic to it, and so on. And I knew that that there was an answer, but the question was, that I had to come up with the answer in a concrete way that would be understandable by people and so on. And so that was a major, task in the book, was to overcome this argument. And basically, the theme is that, so we're sitting here now. We see the dangers of totalitarian organisation and so on, and how governance can easily lead, that power can lead to exploitation rather than benevolence and so on. You can stop your thinking there. And that's largely where the world is at the moment, where it says, so even guys like Schmachtenberger and so on, and in the game B space, basically reject governance, reject global governance and so on, and are looking for bottom-up approaches. And Jim Rutt, who's central in the game B movement, is very explicit about that. He says, we don't know the answer to how to organise highly evolvable, highly adaptive organisations, but we're going to explore bottom-up possibilities. They've rejected the notion that the answer could be in top-down governance-orientated possibilities. So the current state of thinking of the world is, well, we need, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We need solutions, but the answer can't be, governance, and global governance in particular, because that leads to exploitation and so on. The sort of internal feeling I had that identified the task I had in the book was to move people to think there's something the other side of our current analytical rational conceptions of governance, that you need to push through that. You don't hit the wall and turn away and start looking at, wishful thinking bottom-up approaches. You have to push through the mechanistic, exploitative, Borg-like conceptions of governance to the other side, where there's a far more flexible, creative, constrained form of governance that will govern effectively and do what, there's an old Chinese proverb that, that good governor, you should govern the way you fry a fish, lightly.
Right.
And there are emerging conceptions in the leadership literature and so on about how you should do that and so on. And it's instructive in the sense that it's about, it's to solve this problem. How can you govern? How can you manage in such a way as you preserve what you absolutely need if you're going to have a highly evolvable organisation? That is the creativity, the individualism, entrepreneurialism and so on of the constituent entities within the collective. So broadly, so that's the importance also of the evolutionary worldview. The evolutionary worldview is saleable, in my view, saleable to all humans, including those who are currently power hungry, in positions of power. The 1%, the ones who collectively, through collective processes, actually currently run our Western societies and convince us that they're democratic and we have choices and so on and everything else. So the evolutionary worldview basically says to anyone who's in a position of power or anyone who wants to be politically involved that we need governance, but we need to arrange that governance in such a way that that it has the interests of the collective first and foremost when it goes about designing and implementing its governance. So that's the key. How can you constrain the governors, so to speak, even though they're processes rather than individuals? Metasystemically, they're clearly it's governance processes. That the president doesn't run America. To an extent, Putin possibly does run Russia, but he's embedded in circumstances that highly constrain what he can do. So you need to embed the governance processes in constraints that align their interests with the interests of the society as a whole. And so the question then becomes, how do you do that? And arguably, the emergence of the Magna Carta, then democracy, and so on, were attempts to achieve that. I think I mentioned in our first discussion that evolution achieves it through the competition of collectives. So at all lower levels, you have multiple proto-collectives emerge. They're managed organisations. Managers will tend initially to use their power to exploit the organisations and not manage the interests, the organisation in the interests of the organisation as a whole. But when you get a large population of managed collectives competing with one another, then the only managed collectives that can survive and do best in evolutionary terms are those that manage for the interests of the organisation as a whole, don't exploit and so on. Right. So that's the mechanism that's got us up to now, because we had even at the tribal stage, we had large populations of tribes competing with one another that kept them honest, so to speak.
Yeah. Right.
But as the number decreased, then exploitation was less constrained by this evolutionary competitive dynamic between societies, and that led to led to revolutions and so on, where the individuals rebelled against the exploitation of the rulers, led to democracy and so on. But democracy is a very it's an early approximation of what you need to constrain the governors. So the question is, so you absolutely need constraints. You start off with raw and simple constraints like democracy. The system gets gamed and they're less effective than they were 100 years ago.
Very much.
You need to introduce new constraints and so on. So in my writing, I've got a complex proposal for appropriately constraining governance and in effect disaggregating the processes that govern societies. And it's called a vertical market system. And I'll just try and give a very quick flavour for it.
Please.
Right, but it is complex and requires the building of complex mental models in order to sort of see it in its dynamical dimensions. But basically it's this. So economic markets were an enormous leap forward in evolvability collectively in humans. Right. And they, at essence, what they achieved was that they created a circumstance in which any individual in a society that saw an unmet need that could be satisfied by a product or a service, they had the opportunity to entrepreneurially develop a product for that unmet need and offer it in exchange for money, and and they got money which then they could use to buy what other individuals were producing to meet that individual's unmet needs. So that unleashed the enormous creativity of markets. And while markets have a bad name, not as bad as hierarchies, not as bad as the Borg, they are extraordinarily creative and so on. As a collective intelligence process, they have they have the key characteristic of effective collective intelligence processes. That is, they can solve problems that no individual within the process can understand or know how to solve.
Yes.
So a product, that's very basic. A corporation or an individual can produce a product that succeeds and sells and is highly successful, even though their reasons and analysis of the market when they developed the product and tried to sell it got it totally wrong. Right. Yeah. So that's the collective trial and error process that's involved in markets and so on. So, but it's basically this unleashing this thing where any individual has the right to develop a product that they can try and sell. And if it works, it'll satisfy an unmet need, a previously unmet need. So that's horizontal. That's what I call horizontal markets or economic markets. Vertical markets are where you do the same to products that can't be bought and sold on the economic market, in the economic market. They can't be treated as discrete products that don't have externalities that can't be free ridden with and so on. So they're products of governance. That's, in essence, that's what the products of governance are. That's what distinguishes them from goods and services traded in the economic markets. The products of governance are actions, constraints that have collective benefits. Right. That operate across the collective, that have effects that aren't isolatable to individuals, therefore can't be bought and sold by transactions between individuals. So another way of saying it is that the elements of governance that can be bought and sold on what I call a vertical market are the things that can't be bought and sold on the economic market, and they're often the things that are most important to human beings. So we live in this absurd situation at the moment where we can buy and sell freely and produce goods in the economic market, but we can't do the same with governance. So, which produce, the kind of society that you want to live in. Right. A non-Borg-like society. So how do you build a system where the creativity of an economic market is translated into a vertical market where you buy and sell elements of governance? So basically, the economic market was where individuals, whether they be corporations or actual persons, can develop products for unmet needs. In the vertical market, then it's collective products that are bought and sold by collectives. So it's a disaggregation of democracy. Democracy is almost like an economic market in which you can only buy your products every 3 years, and you have to buy them as a parcel. Right. It's an absurd situation. Imagine if you had to buy, economic markets, if they worked on that principle, they wouldn't be creative, they wouldn't be dynamic. Particularly if there are only two suppliers, right, and you had to buy everything as a package every 3 years. That's how we do governance. So you need to disaggregate governance so that the whole package is disaggregated into bits of governance, they can be bought and sold by collectives, the collectives that are impacted by those elements, they can be bought and sold in the vertical market. So you end up with a system of governance that is as dynamic and creative and supports the evolvability that an economic market does. So this is how you, for example, you deal with externalities. So if a vertical market exists, an externality is like an unmet personal need in an economic market. It's a profit opportunity. It's a profit opportunity for any entrepreneur who wants to develop an element of governance that corrects that externality, and ensures that the system can work cooperatively. So what I say is just the end result is this, and it's the way a society should be organised. I mean, it seems to me trivially obvious that if you want to the key characteristic of a self-organising society that self-organises the good, as opposed to our current societies that self-organise destruction of civilization. So you need to arrange the society in such a way that it self-organises the good. And you do that by aligning the interests of individuals and collectives with the interests of the whole. And governance is an essential component of that. If a society is organised in such a way so that the good self-organises, so that it's in the interests of individuals to act in ways that benefit the society, then I say that when Rupert Murdoch's grandchild wakes up in the morning in such a society, and he might be as little concerned about the society, the good of the society, as his grandfather. He has he might have no pro-social motivations at all. Yet nonetheless, when he wakes up in the morning and thinks how he's going to make a fortune and how he's going to make his name, he will include in his assessment of how, for example, he might solve the problem of the million children who die of malnutrition in the world today, and the many millions more whose cognitive capacity is stunted permanently, through inadequate diet and so on. That will be a profit opportunity. Things that are going wrong in the world will be a profit opportunity. Profit opportunities won't be limited to making a better tasting ice cream or a more popular breakfast cereal. They will extend to, developing and producing and implementing appropriate governance. So anyway, that's really, really intriguing. So this is in your book, or this is in other works? It's in the book. But the best explication of it is in and about the self-organising society. That is how to organise society so that the good self-organises, and the good. That's the antidote to the Borg. Just to bring it back to the Borg. That's in a paper. It's called The Self-Organising Society, A Grower's Guide. The Grower's Guide is a reference to marijuana, A Grower's Guide, which was important in my youth. I was a child of the 60s. So it's also, but it got published as Future Possibilities. Can a society be constrained so that the good self-organises? But I think it's in the but Self-Organising Society, A Grower's Guide. A search on Google will find that, or I could give the link to it. Probably it's important to give the link to it because it is the answer to this whole question.
If you could provide me the link, I'd like to put it in the description for this video. That would be great. That would be great.
There's one final comment I need to make, though, is that an important comment is that this is a highly conceptual, highly complex, meta solution to the problem, and it's not going to be implemented today, tomorrow, or whatever. I often say, well, I don't know when it'll happen on this planet, but I know that when galaxies, self-organize, when galaxies are organized as a living entity, they will have vertical markets.
Right.
They won't have democracy and this.
Yeah.
But is it practical in the short term? No. But what is important is as a heuristic that enables us. It's a mental tool that enables us to stand outside our current systems of governance.
It's a regulative ideal, like
exactly. That's it. And so it identifies, how to do, it more mechanistically in the first instance in a way that will produce the greatest benefit, constrain governance the most without being a full vertical market. So it's a guide. So it's a guide to, I worked in government as a policy advisor for years, developing wages policy, industrial relations policy, union policy, and so on. And it's basically the process I use to develop government policy. So you can use the vertical market concepts to design elements of governance within our current system. And you basically design them, any effective policy it's the impositions it imposes will be the minimal necessary to align the interests of those who are going to be affected by the policy with the interests of the whole.
Right.
And so within such a society, it maximizes freedom. So in an effectively governed society, the interests of individuals, of associations, of corporations, of nation states is aligned with the interests of the whole. So from the perspective of the components of the society, they always act within their own interests. They make choices within these minimal constraints, highly evolvable constraints, constrained constraints. They make choices within those, but they actually have more choices because in a cooperative system like our bodies, as opposed to the proto multicellular organisms, you have enormous differentiation. You have division of labour and so on. That's what characterises, once you solve the cooperation problem, as you do in markets, as you do within our bodies, as you do within cells and so on, you get this enormous multiplication of diversity. You get division of labour, you get specialisation. So you get a multiplication of choices. You don't get a constriction of choices. You don't get a mechanistic system. You get a highly evolvable organic system.
I think you answered that question very well, and I really want to read that paper about this, and if you could provide me with that link, I think it would be crucial to put it in the notes, John.
Wonderful.
This has been fantastic and very exciting to participate in this discussion with you. I always like to give my guests the chance to make sort of a final brief comment or final word before I close things off.
Yeah, because you do that, I thought there is some short thing I should emphasise, and that is that the critical significance of the evolutionary worldview, the understanding of these large-scale evolutionary processes in which we're embedded, the critical import of it for us as individuals and collectively is this, that the nature of the system is such that it only completes successfully with the formation of this global superorganism, organising a highly diverse cooperative organisation. It only completes successfully if we intentionally drive the process forward. Mm-hmm. So it's a process where we have to wake up to what's going on this larger scale. We have to wake up to it. And for that, we need metasystemic cognition, unfortunately, because it's just beginning to emerge. We need to wake up to it. We need to see that we have a role, an active role in completing the process. And we then have to, as individuals and collectively, commit to driving that process forward and completing this, the big show, the grand project of life on Earth, you know. And then there'll be sequels beyond that, but but in the foreseeable future, that's where we need to go. So it depends on us. We don't have a free choice, as a lot of the conscious evolution thinking says. We have now reached the stage where we have a free choice to guide our own evolution and do, you know, choose our own evolution. No, once we understand the big picture, we have work to do, we have tasks to do. We have to, from henceforth, if it's to be successful, drive the process intentionally.
Thank you so much, John. That was a great summation. This has been a great pleasure for me. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion as well. Thank you so very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
It's been wonderful to talk, John. As before, it's wonderful to talk with someone with a mind like yours. So thank you.
Thank you, John.